All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Dunk on AP podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the effects of the Cold War. So, without further ado, let's go dunk on AP. So, let's get started with the effects of the Cold War broadly. You're going to get new military alliances. Of course, after World War One, you got new alliances. After World War Two, you're going to get new alliances. After these major conflicts, the board gets shaken up in so many ways because countries rise and fall in power and in relation to each other and in usefulness to each other. So you're also going to get proxy wars. And really, you're going to get the buildup of nuclear weapons. So Berlin gets divided. Of course, we've talked about this a good bit already. After World War II, the post-war occupation zones of Berlin became East and West Berlin. The Berlin blockade was an attempt by Joseph Stalin to take over West Berlin, because remember that Berlin was well in East Germany, but there was half of Berlin was democratic, which West Berlin, and so Stalin blockades it, and this leads to the Berlin airlift. And that is going to be when America, along with some other allied countries, lift in over the course of over 300 days a bunch of supplies to take care of the people of West Berlin. And this sends a message to the rest of the world like, hey, if you're fighting communism, we will take care of you. After the Berlin airlift, the official division of Germany into two states marks the division of Europe as a whole, really into East and West. Eastern Europe includes the Soviet states, the Soviet satellite states, and was called the Eastern Bloc, while Western Europe and non-aligned European nations made up the Western Bloc. So, with over 2.5 million East Germans fleeing West Germany between 1949 and 1961, the Soviet Union is going to react in the most petty way possible, and that is by building the Berlin Wall straight down the middle of Berlin, separating the sides so that people living in East Berlin can't leave and go into West Berlin as they had been doing. And this sends a message to the world in so many ways. If you're trying to win the optics test, this sends a message to the world that communism has to keep people in, whereas democracies, people are trying to escape to. So in this time, you get the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a military alliance formed in 1949 to defend member countries against possible Soviet aggression. Within this, you have Belgium, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Canada, and the United States of America. On the other side of that coin, you have the Warsaw Pact, which is the communist countries who are sort of forming an alliance against NATO. You've got Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Poland, and the Soviet Union. So other new alliances being formed. You've got the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which is Australia, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, and the United States. Then you've also got the Central Treaty Organization. Not super creative with the names here, guys. We've got Great Britain, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Turkey. Now, let's talk about the proxy wars. This is so important when you're talking post World War II. So, with proxy wars, you've got the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Angolan Civil War, and the Sandinista-Contras conflict. And just to define the term proxy war really quick, a proxy war is a war fought between groups or smaller countries that each represent the interests of larger powers. In this case, the larger powers being the United States and the Soviet Union. So Korea, after World War II, this is going to be your first proxy war. They're divided into North, which is the Soviet occupied zone, and then South, which is the Republic of Korea, and it's the US occupation zone. North Korea will be led by a guy named Kim Il sung, who rules the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK. It's quite a mouthful. From 1948 to 1994. Then you've got Syngman Rhee, who was the president of the Republic of Korea from 1948 to 1960. So with the Korean War, North Korea invades South Korea June 25th, 1950. And remember the domino theory. We can't let one country fall to communism or else the rest are going to fall too. So President Rhee evacuates Seoul June 27th of 1950. The UN recommends that UN member states provide military assistance to South Korea on June 27th of 1950. North Korean forces capture Seoul on June 28th of 1950. By June 30th, South Korea lost almost 75% of its troops. President Truman and Congress authorized $12 billion in military aid for South Korea in August 1950. And then the U.S. and UN forces are backed down to Pusan in the southeast by September 1950. Now, in the Battle of Incheon, Commander-in-Chief of the UN forces Douglas MacArthur plans the amphibious surprise attack at Inshan. The UN forces cross the 38th parallel, which prompts further Chinese intervention. Remember, this is the problem with these proxy wars. You got a lot of rules you have to follow. If you are too aggressive, it's going to cause an issue and make the bigger country get involved. The U.S. considers atomic warfare at MacArthur's urging, but no atomic weapons were used in the atomic war. Almost, but not quite. So, with the end of the war ends in July 1953 with a stalemate. Armistice is signed on July 27th, 1953. The DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, was established, and that now is the border between North and South Korea. That is the first proxy war of the Cold War. The Korean War was a crucial point in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union because the USSR provided money and weapons to North Korea and encouraged China to send troops there as well. The U.S. actively fought in the war through UN command. Now, the Vietnam War. Let's get into that for a little bit. So, 1945, communist guerrilla forces led by Ho Chi Minh established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi. 1949, anti-communists led by Bao Dai established a rival government in Saigon, South Vietnam. In 1954, the Vietnam War officially begins, and soon after, Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel. But remember that at first, Vietnam is fighting against France. Ngo Dinh Diem becomes the president of South Vietnam in 1955 and relinquishes any claim to North Vietnam. Now, 1957, South Vietnam fails to gain entry into the UN because the Soviet Union vetoed their bid. In 1960, the Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front for South Vietnam, another mouthful, emerged as a guerrilla front in South Vietnam that was armed by North Vietnam and backed by China and the Soviet Union. Important one there. So, Ngo Dinh Diem visits the U.S. in 1957 and is heralded as a champion of freedom in a sea of communism. Eisenhower calls him the miracle of Asia. Now, from May to November in 1963, the Buddhist crisis in South Vietnam happens. In May, 9 unarmed civilians were shot and killed while protesting a ban on the Buddhist flag. In June, a Buddhist monk burns himself alive in protest. The shocking pictures are widely circulated and are very, very difficult for the world to stomach. Now, from here, you're going to get President Kennedy pressuring Diem to enact reforms to stop the Buddhist protests, but President Diem continues to authorize oppression of Buddhists in South Vietnam. In November 2nd, 1963, President Diem is assassinated during a possibly U.S.-backed coup to remove him from power. We aren't sure of that, but the problem in a lot of cases with these proxy wars is that countries like America, we're going to have to back up guys who, yes, they are not communist, but they're not necessarily always the best guys either. And so that puts you in kind of a rock and a hard place. So moving on from there, with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. August of 1964, the USS Maddox reports a North Vietnamese attack on a U.S. ship, which is the USS Maddox. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was quickly passed, and that gives Lyndon Johnson, because by this point JFK has been assassinated, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was quickly passed, and it gave President Lyndon Johnson the authority to use military force in Vietnam without declaring war, which is a big deal because typically to declare war, you have to have the power of Congress. You have to have the approval of Congress. America is going to fight the extremely unpopular Vietnam War from 1964 to about 1974. Really, and those dates are rough. You could say 1963 to 1974. And the final, the collapse of South Vietnam is going to happen very shortly after America leaves in 1974. It happens in 1975. But the reason why America is so unsuccessful is because the North Vietnamese knew the terrain so well, despite the fact that American soldiers kill way more North Vietnamese soldiers than North Vietnamese soldiers kill of American soldiers. It doesn't change the fact that America gives up because the war is so unbelievably unpopular at home. So the U.S. Under President Nixon withdraws troops in 1973. Fighting in Vietnam goes on until 1975 when North Vietnam took the southern city of Saigon and united all of Vietnam under communist rule, and it is still communist to this day. Now, moving to the Angolan Civil War. So in the MPLA, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, against the UNITA, the National Union for Total Independence of Angola, they're going to be up against each other. The Soviet Union, Cuba, and Brazil back up the MPLA. That's the Marxist-Leninist faction. And then the anti-communist faction is going to be backed up by South Africa and the United States, the UNITA. So this is going to last from about 1975 till roughly 2002. America gets involved when President Gerald Ford in 1975 approves aid to UNITA to fight the Soviet-backed MPLA through Operation IA Feature. Then in 1976, opposition in the U.S. to the funding of UNITA over concerns of an escalation of the Cold War results in the Clark Amendment that blocks U.S. funding to UNITA until 1986. So what happens from here is that Ronald Reagan is going to meet with the rebel leader of UNITA, Jonas Savimba, in 1986, and the Clark Amendment is repealed in 1985. Reagan meets with Jonas Savimba in 1986, as I said, and the U.S. begins supplying military aid to UNITA in 1986. So aid and support to UNITA is matched with Soviet and Cuban aid to MPLA, which is, of course, now that both sides are in, it is going to cause a quick escalation in the Angolan Civil War, and that will make it a key Cold War conflict. So a ceasefire at the end of the Angolan Civil War, or roughly the end of it. So ceasefire is negotiated in 1988, and it falls apart the following year. The MPLA cuts ties with the Soviet Union in 1990 and abandoned the one-party Marxist system. President Clinton, who had become president by this time, announces that the UNITA was a threat to U.S. goals. This no longer will be a Cold War proxy war, but the Civil War continues until 2002, even though America and the Soviet Union are not really involved in it anymore. Then you've got the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. You've got the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, or the FSLN, as we will from here on out refer to it. So what's going to happen is that you've got Contra camps in Honduras and Costa Rica. Not concentration camps, Contra camps. And what you're going to get is Soviet aid going to Cuba and then Cuban aid going to fund this. The Sandinista military aid came primarily from Cuba and the Soviet Union, and like I said, going through Cuba. You've got Adolfo Calero Portocarrero, who was the leader of the Contras, who was backed by the United States. Now, what you're going to get is the Sandinistas both and Contras both had problems that needed to be solved by ending fighting. In 1989, both sides agreed to demobilize troops and set a date for free elections. In February of 1990, Sandinista incumbent Daniel Ortega lost the election to Contra supporter Violeta Barrios Torres de Chamorro in what was considered a surprising result. So Fidel Castro and Cuba, let's move to that now because this one is very, very important. So Cuba has long been sort of had a very interesting relationship with America, not always great. So remember that Cuba became a U.S., not a territory, not a state, but sort of a protectorate after the Spanish-American War when the U.S. beats Spain in Cuba because Cuba was controlled by Spain. So the U.S.-backed Fulgencio Batista gets overthrown by Fidel Castro in 1959. Castro began to then nationalize foreign and U.S.-owned industries in Cuba. The U.S. will cut ties with Cuba, and Cuba begins accepting aid from the Soviet Union at that time. So the Bay of Pigs invasion, this is in 1961. JFK is going to greenlight an invasion. The plan actually was hatched during the Eisenhower administration, but JFK will sign off on it. Basically, they send a group of exiled Cubans down to Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. And it's sort of like, oh, wait, what? There's a group of exiled Cubans down there, but they were American trained. This doesn't work. The Cubans were ready for it, and it's going to be a failed proxy invasion of Cuba. When the invasion came into the international spotlight, Kennedy did not send in planned air support. Basically, he says, hey, you guys are on your own. Castro's forces defeated the invasion within 3 days, making Bay of Pigs a huge failure and a massive embarrassment to the new Kennedy presidency. And this probably in a lot of ways helps lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So October 1962, you get Kennedy demanding the removal of missiles from Cuba after photo reconnaissance realizes or brings light to the fact that the Soviet Union has put missiles in Cuba 70 miles away from the U.S. coast. October 22nd, you get a naval quarantine or a blockade of Cuba to prevent more incoming missiles, but that doesn't solve the problem of the missiles that are already there. October 26th, Soviet ships with nuclear missiles inbound for Cuba turn around because of the blockade. So a U.S. spy plane is also shot down over Cuba on October 26th. October 27th, a Soviet submarine with nuclear torpedoes is forced to the surface. October 28th, the Soviet Union agrees to remove missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. agrees to remove its missiles from Turkey secretly, and that ends the Cuban Missile Crisis. But this is darn near the closest that America ever gets to World War III. And this is going to help lead to the anti nuclear weapons movement. Nuclear testing by the United States and Soviet Union became more and more frequent. Testing by the US in Bikini Atoll exposed inhabited areas to fallout. The Soviet Union tested the largest ever bomb in 1961. And then there's also anti-nuclear weapons movement beginning in Japan in 1954 and spreading around the world in 1970s and 1980s. And this is actually where Godzilla comes from, is that it's meant to be an allegory for the effect of nuclear weapons on Japan. So the Test Ban Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Test Ban Treaty signed in 1963 bans the testing of nuclear weapons above ground, underwater, and in space. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed in 1968 prevents nuclear powers from spreading nuclear technology to non-nuclear nations. So this was a long episode. This was covering 8.3, the effects of the Cold War.